So those were the conditions from 2002 to 2008. And then in 2008, we had the global economic downturn. And the two most significant results from my perspective were that by many organizations' estimates, including the World Bank's, tens of millions of people were returning to abject poverty in the developing world. Abject poverty, as I mentioned earlier, is defined by $1.25 a day that people have to live on, or are living on. The other major development was that in April 2009, the G20, without any viable mechanism to return to the international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and pledged to devote $1.1 trillion in funding to help these institutions help developing countries stave off the effects of the global economic downturn. So after years of being an ineffective lobbyist on behalf of the poor, in 2008, the World Bank returned to center stage, more powerful and richer than it had ever been before. And I think the question that we should ask is, will they be any more effective in reducing global poverty than they have been in the past? I don't think it's fair for us to answer that question today, but I do think it's fair to ask it. So I will turn the discussion to the issue of, well, what should be done with the World Bank? And for folks who've been following this discussion, this debate on reforming the internal governance of the World Bank, there's been a lot of dialogue, and you may have heard some of it, about how to change the World Bank to make it a more effective, more representative institution for developing countries. And some of the things that people have been talking about is changing the composition and the size and the expertise of the Board of Executive Directors, increasing access to the Board of Directors meetings, giving greater voice to poor countries on the bank's operating boards, and making the presidential selection process merit-based and transparent. Traditionally, the World Bank's president is selected by the U.S. government. Some people think that it should be an open process and the most qualified person should be selected as opposed to whoever the U.S. government decides should be selected. My perspective is that these are good reforms. Some have been implemented to various degrees. Others have not been considered seriously. They're all positive. But these reforms that are being discussed by development think tanks, development NGOs, donors, borrowers, and the G20 are really focused at the top-tier structure of the institution and its relationship with stakeholders and shareholders. My perspective, based on a very different understanding of the institution, is that these changes will only be incremental and that they won't have a serious impact, or they won't have as serious an impact on how the World Bank operates and how it acts and how it thinks, as thinking about changing the cultural norms of the institution. And for that perspective, as an insider who's been watching the World Bank for a number of years, I've worked there for 12 years, I think it's important to change the cultural norms, the way people behave, the incentives that they have to take the actions that they do. And so in the World Bank today, they have a variety of accountability mechanisms. Accountability mechanisms are oversight mechanisms that are internal to the World Bank that determine if the World Bank is lending effectively, if it is committed in infraction of its rules or regulations, if there should be some sort of changes in policy. And I think there's a conflict of interest in having these internal mechanisms, these internal accountability mechanisms inside the World Bank. Because if they're inside the World Bank, then senior management can disregard the recommendations. They don't have to implement them. They're not required to do that. They can mute the recommendations that come from these accountability mechanisms. They can silence them. And so I think the biggest positive change that could happen for the World Bank is to take these accountability mechanisms and move them to outside the institution to independent arbitrators. The second thing that I think the World Bank should be doing is that I think it needs to reform the way it selects managers and project managers and task leaders. The way the World Bank prizes academic excellence. And indeed, the running joke is that there's more PhDs at the World Bank than any other organization in the world. There's nothing wrong with academic excellence. It also prizes technocratic expertise, and there's nothing wrong with that either. And there's plenty of both at the World Bank. It's dominated by these two qualities. But what the World Bank's management core lacks is leadership skills. They lack entrepreneurial skills. There's very little innovation that appears to happen at the institution. And so I think the bank would be would do itself well if it attracted innovators, entrepreneurs, people who have real leadership skills. Because development is a difficult and complex business. And so you need that sort of quality to bring about change, to bring about innovation, to create motivation and enthusiasm in the working force of the institution. The third thing that I would recommend is to place a civil society representative on the board of directors. This might seem like a radical suggestion, but I think it would take civil society actors out of the criticism business and put them in the wheel building business. And so and would increase their ability to participate in World Bank decisions. And I think it would reduce some of the criticisms that the bank faces from civil society actors. And so I think it would be very positive, but it would have checks and balances on both ends. The fourth thing that I would do, I would change, the World Bank has a learning and pedagogical arm called the World Bank Institute. And the World Bank Institute's model is basically what former bank economist David Ellerman called a library storehouse model, where it would dispense knowledge nuggets to country representatives. This is what we learned, this is what we think you should be doing. And then they'll provide training on that. Ellerman argues that instead of having a library storehouse knowledge model for dispensing information and knowledge sharing, it should have an open learning model where the bank offers a variety of experiences to developing country regulators and officials, and lets them choose what fits their particular situation, and then builds lending projects that they would support. And the final reform that I would suggest is to revive something, what we built with B-SPAN as a medium of open knowledge sharing, transparent knowledge sharing, because I think it would improve the image of the World Bank. It would allow access inside the World Bank to important development knowledge, and it would create a medium that the World Bank would value, because people would come to the World Bank because it's the center of development knowledge, as opposed to asking for loans to get that knowledge. So I will stop it here, and I'll entertain any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
How many employees are employed by the World Bank? And which country has the largest number of employees, and which country has the least number of employees?
Well, I don't have precise information, but there's approximately 10,000 people who work at the World Bank. Most of them are based in Washington, but there's a significant amount of personnel outside the United States. My understanding is that the largest percentage of World Bank employees are American. The United Kingdom has a significant amount of employees there, as does Germany. There are a lot of folks from China and India, but I don't have precise figures.
The African countries represented?
I'm sorry?
The African countries represented?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The vice president of the Africa department is from Africa. So, no, there's the World Bank, I mean, one of the structural inefficiencies of the World Bank is the fact that it is an institution that has workers from 185 countries. And so they come to the institution with their own perspectives. And then within many of these countries, there are differences of opinion because there's many subcultures within one country. So inside the institution, you have a vast array of people with different perspectives, which made the B-SPAN experience quite interesting because you could take a concept and different people would have vastly different perspectives on the same concept. So the concept of transparency, openness, accountability would be more closely adopted by some folks and rejected by others for their own cultural reasons.
Do you work with the United Nations?
The bank does work with the United Nations. I'm not sure about that relationship, the exact nature of it.
Thank you.
The bank mostly is working with governments, both donor and borrowing governments, to develop lending ideas and lending projects that are focused on improving development in various ways. Yes, ma'am.
You're still at the World
No.
Bank? Oh.
I left in 2005,
Oh.
and from 2005 to 2009, I did research and worked on the book.
And what sort of reaction is your book having within the World Bank? Is it being discussed in the hallways or buried in the covers, or what's the reaction?
I think the answer is a little bit of both. There is the official reaction and the unofficial reaction. I should say that I think the World Bank is more transparent now than it has been in the past. It has made progress on being more open. It has made progress on its accountability and its willingness to include external actors in its policymaking and lending activities. Having said that, I would say that the institution has made progress over the last 2 decades, but it's because it's been pressured from external sources, donors, borrowers, civil society actors, whether in think tanks or in organizations. And so I don't think it's inherent in the culture to be more transparent and more accountable. It's being pressured to make these steps forward, but I think we should give credit where credit's due. With regards to how folks have been reacting, as I noted, there's an official reaction and there's an unofficial reaction. I'll start with the unofficial reaction, which is more anecdotal, that people from both inside the bank and outside the bank respond very positively to the book. The book may look like an expose that is designed to criticize the institution. It is not. It is a book that talks about the strengths of the institution, but also talks about the weaknesses, and I try to do it in a fair, open, and honest way, with the idea that I hope the book is taken in the spirit that's intended, which is to provide opportunities to identify weaknesses and to work on them to make them strengths. So unofficially, folks inside the institution have been very positive. The official view is silence, and this is by design. Whenever a book comes out that is less than comfortable for the World Bank purposely refrains from comment in the hopes that the book will die or the report will die a quiet death. It will sink below the waves, never to be heard from again. And so that is the strategy. They don't want to give credibility to books like this because then they'll have to answer the tough questions that a book like this raises. And another motivation is that the World Bank is always in a fundraising mode. It's always raising money for IDA, which is the branch of the institution that lends, does concessional lending to the very poorest of countries and it goes through a 3-year cycle all the time of raising capital for that. It is now going through a general capital increase, the first one in about 2 decades, that will infuse the bank's coffers by many billions of dollars. And there's always various other initiatives to increase the bank's capital. So when you're in a fundraising mechanism all the time, and something comes out, a book like this or a report that says something uncomfortable, the bank does not want to answer to its critics because they control the funding. If somebody in Congress, the US Congress, was to get up and say, well, Dave Shaman wrote this book and he's talked about some of these issues and they're very uncomfortable, what do you have to say? Well, now that's bad for the brand, that's bad for the image of the World Bank. And the external relations folks who have an appropriate role for the institution have to answer those questions. And it can be difficult. It's kind of a long-winded answer to.
The president is the head of the World Bank, president. Is that right?
Yes.
He's appointed by Congress?
He is appointed by, technically he's appointed by the Treasury Department. Well, I mean, that's not correct. Unofficially, there's an unofficial agreement between the US and the Europeans that the US government gets to appoint or nominate the World Bank president. And that has been what has happened in the past. And that informal agreement between the rich countries of the world is now under some strain. The Europeans have had the prerogative to nominate the managing director of the IMF. So that's the informal agreement that's in place. And the nominations to the World Bank presidency have come from the Treasury Department.
What's the IMF? How is that related to the World Bank?
Well, they're both part of Bretton Woods institutions, which were the institutions that were created at the close of World War II to get a hold of the world's economy, to steer it away from some of the conditions that were exacerbating the warlike conditions in World War II. Yes, ma'am.
Well, how do you see the relationship between IMF and World Bank? Because that hasn't been very good. And how do you see this evolving right now?
In what terms? In what terms?
The chief economists of the World Bank have been very critical of IMF and vice versa. Stiglitz, etc., have been blaming one another. Do you see this changing? Do you see the two organizations working together?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the IMF and the World Bank have different roles.
Right.
The IMF is designed to stabilize the financial architecture of countries that are having some problems, some vibrations in their economies on an emergency type of basis. The World Bank is designed to do development, and so the perspectives of the two institutions are different. Some of the operating mechanisms are similar, but there has been a significant amount of criticism by some officials between each agency of the practices of the other. But I think there's a lot of synergies and there's a lot of working relationships that are very close between the two organizations.
Do you think these institutions are just obsolete right now?
No, I
Based
don't.
on your research?
No, I don't. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bothered to write the book. I think the World Bank is a critically important institution to help people in the developing world. Now, it's true that it used to be that the World Bank would do $20 billion in lending annually, and that has increased by some number in the aftermath of the global economic crisis. But if you compared the World Bank's lending, whether it's 20 billion or 40 billion or 50 billion, it'd still be a small percentage of the actual development assistance that is coming from individual donor countries or the private sector, which vastly, which provides a lot more capital to the developing world than the World Bank. But the World Bank is seen as a leader in development assistance. Where the World Bank goes, others will follow. And in fact, private capital flows tend to move away from countries that are experiencing economic vibrations. And so it's the World Bank's duty and mantra to go into countries where others may not. And if the World Bank didn't exist, these countries might not have viable options for development assistance. So the World Bank plays a very important role, and my goal is to try to point out some of the weaknesses in the institution so it becomes a much more effective, efficient organization in doing what its mission is to do, which is to reduce global poverty. And so I don't see myself as a critic, I see myself more as somebody who's shining a flashlight on some of the problems, in the hopes that the institution and the folks who are outside the institution and working with it, whether in various countries or whether in civil society, opportunities to improve it.
Who's the largest donor country?
That is the United States.
Is that why
Is that
the United
percentage-wise?
States-
Yes, it is. It is percentage-wise, closely followed by the United Kingdom. And the United States has the greatest voice on the bank's operating boards. And so
Is
it
that
is.
because they're the largest donor? They have the most say-so, and that in turn, they
Yes,
select the president
and it's been
make the
traditional.
rules.
I mean, when the World Bank was invented in 1944, the United States was in the process of leading the Allies to victory in World War II. And the rest of the Allies, most notably the Western Europeans, were essentially bankrupt by World War II. They didn't have the working capital to subsidize the World Bank. The United States did. So the United States was politically positioned to be the linchpin on how the World Bank operated going forward. And so when the Articles of Agreement were written up, they really favored the United States to a degree that was significant and has allowed the United States to play a highly influential role in how the bank is built and how the bank operates. Yes, sir.
You bring in your book, this politician, Lyndon LaRouche. He hands out literature at these metro stations, and he always brings in the Bretton Woods Agreement. Talks about that.
Lyndon LaRouche does not appear in my book. Yes, ma'am.
China is being very strategic and very generous in its role in capitalizing underdeveloped nations. How would you compare China's activities with the World Bank percentage-wise and strategy-wise?
Well, China has become a major player in the development paradigm. China is probably the most important emerging market country in the World Bank's portfolio. It is also playing a major role there's a great effort to provide more voice and vote power in the bank's operating boards for emerging market countries such as China and India. And in fact, the Chinese are very active in doing bilateral development assistance, and in particular to sub-Saharan Africa. So they are increasingly becoming a major player in development assistance. And what the research is showing is that a large body of work is happening between China and many countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Is that through the World Bank or is that unilaterally?
It's
Because
bilaterally.
okay. Well, with the other organization, with the other countries. So it's
with the Chinese government and governments
and
directly.
the governments, but not necessarily the World Bank. So
No,
not
no.
Okay.
Yeah, but
So-
I mean, China's kind of an interesting situation. Their wealth is growing, their ability to influence is growing, but they're still a borrower at the World Bank. Their power within the institution is growing. They still have dramatic levels of poverty, but they've also made some dramatic gains. poverty reduction. In fact, a large percentage of the gains that the World Bank likes to cite in poverty reduction, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, a large percentage of that is coming from China and India. So,
I don't quite understand, China is financing our debt, and yet
And we're
they,
a large
they
giving
come
it to the World Bank so they can
knocking-
loan it to China.
and then
It's
they
nonsensical.
knocking at the World Bank door, and the U.S., the major contributor, loans money back out to them, and yet they're setting up these bilateral agreements with sub-Saharan Africa. And do you know how much money they're
And Central
funneling?
America and South America too.
A lot.
I never suggested that all of this makes sense,
Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay.
but that
I
seems
don't
to be the
understand
case.
why they would do that, but do you know how much money China is pumping into?
No, I don't have any data at my
Is that-
fingertips.
Is that
But that's,
secretive on their part?
I don't know if it's secretive, I just don't have the data in front of me.
The Economist magazine, economist.com, you could probably Google that, and they might have some snippets in there. They do a good job of providing some summaries of what they're doing, you know.
And it has a lot to do with oil.
Yeah.
Sub-Saharan Africa has a
Oh,
lot.
absolutely, yeah, sure.
And
All that
China
natural
is
resources.
tapping into their oil.
And it's caught the attention of a lot of people, so
So
it's, I'm
that's-
sure
that's
that
the
information is out there.
And also rare earth metals as well.
Yes,
That is a
yes.
huge,
Yes.
there's a lot of our super secret technology that, you know, is dependent on rare earth metals. Russia develops a lot of rare earth metals, a lot of the communist countries, or, well, that former communist country. China does, and they're actually capturing a lot of the rare earths. There's no short-term peril involved, but over a 25-year period, there could be, with some of the rare earths as well. So there's,
Right, absolutely, I mean, this is.
yeah, China has a, and don't get me wrong, I mean, the United States, when we do our investment too, we're always going to protect our interests, but there's got to be a balance, like he's sort of saying, if the World Bank, if I understand, you're not really providing many answers, you're just shedding a light on some questions of how can it be more transparent, more efficient, bring more leadership in to have more impact locally for
Well,
pulling people out of
in
their poverty,
perspective,
is what I understand.
in the perspective of the World Bank, I hope I do provide some
Yeah.
opportunities that the bank should be exploring. Some of the actors that are observing the bank should be pursuing or pressuring the institution to think about more closely. So I
Do
think.
the IMF compete for funding in the World Bank? Do they compete with donor nations?
There's no formal competition for funding. They're not
But they
vying
get the funding from the same donors?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And so, these extractive resources that are so valuable in Africa, I remember from way back when the apartheid issue was such a hot button issue in South Africa, a lot of the hesitation that was coming from pressure South Africa to eliminate apartheid was being compelled by the fact that Western societies needed access to these resources that were in, these precious resources that were in South Africa. So the point being is that Africa has these resources that are not available elsewhere. Russia also is a location that has these type of resources. That influences some of the development dollars. It probably influences some of the motivations for the Chinese and others. I'm not an expert on that, so. But to go back to your point, I believe that the book does provide some opportunities. It doesn't just ask the questions, and it doesn't reveal some of the flaws. I think it provides opportunities for people to enter into an intelligent, unemotional dialogue on what is in the best interest for this institution. Because quite frankly, this institution, World Bank, has the capacity to not just improve people's lives and hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people's lives, it has the capacity to save people's lives and hundreds of millions and perhaps billions of people if it gets its business right, if it's more efficient, more effective. Now, I'm not suggesting